In today's story, the IRS sends the 2020 stimulus checks to dead people. Mary Johnson died in 2018. Last week, her heirs received a stimulus check in the mail for $1,200, payable to Mary L. Johnson, deceased. "We had a good laugh about it," said her son, Tim Martin Johnson, of Philadelphia. "She's been gone 2 years. We laughed about how the check actually said deceased on it." After the laughter died down, Johnson, who was the executor of his mother's estate, was faced with a potentially consequential dilemma. "I tried to figure out what to do," he said. "I was pretty sure we couldn't accept it." The IRS has discovered that it has mailed checks to dead people by mistake. It's unclear how many such stimulus checks have been delivered, but it's thought to be significant because about 2 million people in the U.S. die each year. The government wants their stimulus check money back. Back in March of 2020, Congress authorized stimulus check payments as part of the massive coronavirus aid, relief, and economic security (CARES) Act. Generally, the payment is $1,200 for single filers, or $2,400 for joint filers, plus $500 per qualified child. But these amounts are phased out based on income. During the last month, the Internal Revenue Service has paid out more than $207 billion in economic impact payments to individuals as part of the $2 trillion pandemic stimulus package, the CARES Act. But the act was written so quickly that no one bothered to ensure that the money wouldn't be sent to the dead, said Nina Olson, a former IRS official and current executive director of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. Olson estimates that the IRS may have mailed thousands of checks, potentially worth tens of millions of dollars, to people who the agency should have known had breathed their last. The IRS began distributing the money in April of 2020 to taxpayers with direct deposit information on file from 2018 and 2019 returns, and then followed up with paper checks. Now, this stimulus package program is in full throttle. But suppose a person has died since they filed their last tax return? The IRS has discovered that it has mailed checks to deceased people by mistake. It's unclear how many such checks have been delivered, but it's thought to be significant. After all, more than 2 million people in the U.S. die each year, as noted earlier. Now, the IRS is asking for checks paid to deceased individuals to be returned by those who have their hands on the money. It recently updated its frequently asked questions (FAQ) section for stimulus payments on the official IRS site by stating that someone who has died is ineligible for the payment, and providing the following instructions. Paper checks should be returned by writing "void" in the endorsement section on the back of the check. The check should be mailed back to an IRS office, depending on the state where the recipient resides. The IRS also requests the person to include a note explaining the reason for returning the check. For direct deposits received on behalf of deceased taxpayers, the IRS asks that the person send a personal check or money order to the appropriate IRS office. See FAQ number 41, payable to the U.S. Treasury. They should write 2020 EIP ;space and the taxpayer's Social Security number or individual taxpayer identification number on the check, and add a brief explanation for the return. Similarly, incarcerated individuals are not eligible for stimulus check payments, so checks sent to inmates should also be returned. Presumably, these checks were based on tax returns filed prior to the individual being incarcerated. A spouse who isn't in prison can keep his or her portion of the money. The same basic rules apply to undocumented immigrants. The government wants their money back. There has also been reports of individuals receiving checks paid to the benefit of a deceased individual who is very much alive. There has been no official comment on this. But tax experts also said last week that this issue is a little more complicated. There's nothing in the law that would require the return, they say. And the government has made the same mistake before. Nearly 2.8 million Americans died in 2018, the last year that the number of deaths was available. According to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's unknown how many of the deceased received relief money in the recent weeks. Whether someone who received a check was dependent on whether they or their estate had filed a tax return in 2019 or 2018. It's terrible, because we're dealing with human beings who are still struggling with a recent loss in their lives, said Olson. It's part of what happens when you have to get money out quickly. You know you're going to be inaccurate. Whether the checks must be returned or not may be a matter of personal conscience. But what would you do? Would you do as the government expects you to and return it? Or would you keep it? You're not supposed to keep that payment, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin told the Wall Street Journal in a story published April 28. We're checking the databases, but there could be a scenario where we miss something. And yes, the heirs should be returning the money. It took the IRS until May 6th to post information on its website FAQ, asking heirs to comply. But the space IRS can't do much more than ask, said Martin Abo, of an accounting firm, Abo & Company, LLC in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. It's still unclear whether you would actually have to do it. There's really nothing in the law to say you have to give the stimulus check back, said Abo, who has received multiple inquiries about the checks written to the dead. But stand advised. Olson, of Taxpayers' Rights, concurred. There's no legal interpretation, she said. I don't know how they're basing their decision to ask for the money back. Every week, the IRS receives a master death file of every American who has died. They know these persons are deceased, Olson said. Now, someone in their families is being told they have to go to the post office, stand in line, and mail the check back. It's very disturbing. She said it is unlikely the IRS would pursue the stimulus check money that it had erroneously awarded. It will cost more to file the suits than it's worth, Olson said. History also indicates that little will be done to recover the money. In 2008, the Department of Treasury sent rebate checks of $300 to $600 to millions of Americans, which many of them have been long dead. Olson, then the national taxpayer advocate for the IRS, testified before Congress about the mix-up. During questioning, U.S. Representative Lloyd Doggett of Texas pointed out that his late mother had been granted $300. The IRS then did not seem to make an effort to have that money returned, at least, not yet. What do you think would happen to you if you don't return a stimulus check error, as instructed by the IRS? I guess There's only one way to find out. People call me Mr. Bone Chiller. If you're enjoying my scary horror stories, comment below with the words, Bone Chilled, subscribe to my channel, and click the bell notification icon, so you don't miss any of my new, bone-chilling stories I've got coming up.